Hello everybody, this is Betsy Veldman for Papertrey Inc. and I am hosting your Make It Monday challenge this week. This week I'm going to show you a technique for stamping using your re-inkers and also adding some heat embossing over the top for a really pretty effect. So let's get started. For this technique you need re-inkers in the colors of your choice and a sheet of acetate. I like to use the sheets that my stamps come on, and also a water bottle and embossing powder. We're going to start by creating sort of a palette on our sheet of acetate using the re-inkers, and what we're going to do is just add a few drops. This is an aqua mist, and then I have limeade ice, and I'm just going to squiggle a little bit of that onto my acetate. And then I have Harvest Gold, add a little more, and then this is Hibiscus Burst. Just going to finish it off with that. You can kind of think about the orders that you want the colors to fade into as you put the ink onto your acetate. And then what we're going to do is we're going to take a bottle of water and just mist that with a little bit of water, and we're going to let those colors blend together. You can even kind of shake it around and mix those up a little bit if you'd like. Alright, this is what we're going to use to do our stamping. So I'm going to start with a piece of white cardstock. This is the Stamper Select cardstock from Papertrey. And I'm going to use this corner flower cluster from the Mini Blooms set, and I'm going to just ink it up using this palette of ink that we just created. And you can kind of select the colors that you want. You can see how I kind of almost rolled it in that ink. And then I'm just going to stamp it onto my cardstock, and you can see it's kind of making a mess here. But I'm going to keep my my stamp on my paper a little bit longer than I typically would when stamping with regular ink. This lets that moisture really absorb into the cardstock and lets that cardstock just soak that up, so that when I lift my stamp up, it stays put. Looks a little messy now, but we're going to be adding some embossing later to really kind of define those flowers. And then I'm going to just ink it up again using that same technique, and then I'm going to stamp it again in the lower right corner here. Again, just letting that sit, pressing that really firmly into my paper and letting it soak up all of that moisture. And there is our second image. Alright, now this needs to completely dry before we add some embossing over the top. And I like to speed up this process using my heat gun because I'm not very patient at all when it comes to crafting. I like to move on to the next step as quickly as possible. So I'm going to just use my heat gun to dry this, this watercolor here all the way. You don't want to leave it damp. Otherwise your embossing powder is going to stick in areas that you don't want it to. Watercolor is completely dry, and now we're going to move on to adding some embossing over the top. For this step I'm going to be using Versamark ink. I'm going to be using the same stamp that we used to do our watercolor. It's that same corner flower cluster from the Mini Blooms set. And I'm going to stamp it again here using my Versamark. You can see where I'm not lining it up exactly with the first image. I'm going to offset that a little bit. And also the watercolor image kind of ran a little bit. The image is larger than it's going to be with our Versamark and our embossing. And that's going to let that watercolor show from behind our embossed image. And here I'm going to just ink it up again and stamp it again right over top of that second flower cluster in the bottom corner. Alright, then we can go ahead and add our embossing powder. I'm just using a white Zing powder. This is the embossing powder that the Papertrey ink carries in their store. And just go ahead and coat our stamped images with this white embossing powder. And you can see already how the embossing is going to give the flowers much more definition than the watercolor stamping. The watercolor stamping is really kind of abstract since we have all of that moisture in with our re-inkers. You don't get a crisp image, of course. But the embossing over the top is going to give the definition to those images. And the watercolor is just going to be a really pretty background effect. And you could do this with any stamps, really. It also works well for stamps that are two-step stamping, that have the image and then an outline image. You can stamp the solid image with the watercolor, and then you could do the outline image, inverse mark, and emboss that. If you don't have stamps that are two-step stamps, for example, if you had just an outline stamp, you could also flip the stamp on your block and use the back side of the stamp to do the watercolor, and then use the outline detail to do your embossing. So as you can see, I'm just heating my embossing powder here. Okay, so our embossing is finished, and now what we're going to do is we're going to add a stamped sentiment inside, kind of right in that open area between the two flower clusters. And I'm going to be using this So Happy For You stamp, sentiment stamp, which is also from the Mini Bloom set, and I'm going to stamp it using some smoky shadow ink. I'm going to position that just right in that opening left from our flowers. Alright, there we go. Now we're going to add a few die cut butterflies. I have a couple here. These are from the Beautiful Butterflies set. I die cut those from white cardstock. And we are going to add some watercolor stamping onto our die cuts here as well. We're not going to be doing any embossing on these, but we're just going to stamp with our watercolor palette here. Once again, I'm going to grab that. And I'm just going to ink up my smaller butterfly stamp. And you can see how I'm positioning it here so that I am getting all of the colors of ink onto my stamp. And then I'll just go ahead and press that onto my die cut. And again, I'm going to let it set there a little longer than I typically would with regular stamping and regular ink, and let that moisture really absorb up into that cardstock. Alright, there's our first butterfly. And then we're going to do the same thing with this larger butterfly. Go ahead and stamp that one onto the die cut. Letting all that moisture just really absorb into the cardstock again. Alright, and there are two very beautiful watercolor butterflies. Now we need those to dry as well before we add them to our card. And again, I'm just going to take my heat gun and I'm going to speed up that process a little bit. Alright, so they are completely dry and ready to go. So we're going to assemble our card now. I have a Berry Sorbet card base here. This is just a standard 5.5 by 4 1/4. And we're going to add here our stamped panel onto the card base. If your cardstock warped a little bit with all of the watercoloring and the heat embossing, just make sure to add a little bit of extra adhesive around the edges and it should really take care of the problem. Alright, so there we go. Now I'm going to take our stamped butterflies here and I'm going to adhere those with a little bit of foam adhesive. I like to buy my foam on a roll, That lets me cut any size that I need. Here I can cut it just a kind of a narrow strip to fit right down the center of those butterflies. And that way I can fold up their wings a little bit for some added dimension. I'm going to put one up in the upper left corner in the space between those flower clusters, and the second one I'm going to add down here in the bottom, just for a nice balanced look. That's all for today's technique. I thought it would be super fun for using on spring cards, Easter cards. It's just kind of a fun, pretty, springy look. So I hope you guys have a great week and you find some time to play along this week, and I can't wait to see what you come up with. This has been Betsy Veldman for Papertrey Ink.